Hi, guys. Welcome to COVID Commentary SLC. We've put together a real thought-provoking show for our listeners tonight. As always, you can find us on Facebook if you go ahead and search up COVID Commentary SLC. You can like us there and then check out all the links that we post about the show and just other random thoughts we have about it. We're building a good following now. I think we broke about 170 follows today, so that's awesome to see that start climbing up and start getting some interaction from our audience. We enjoyed the show that we did with Sheldon so much on Wednesday that we decided to go ahead and have him on again for our Friday show. So it's nice to have you here, Sheldon.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
So CJ, before the show, you were just telling us about how you visited the hospital for kind of a standard procedure. What was it like being there?
Initially it was kind of a shock just because walking in, even when I called to check in and do all the pre-screening for my appointment, they had just asked me if I had a temperature and asked me if I showed any symptoms for COVID, and just told them no. And I was actually planning on going with my girlfriend, and we had both walked in the door, and as we walked in the door, they said, "Okay, who's being seen?" And I said, "Me," and they said, "Okay, that's fine, but she has to leave. Only you can go in." And that was a little surprising, but I understand, and it wasn't something that I took offense to. It was almost something that I praised them for actually doing. But as you walked in, they took your temperature, and that was right at the door. They actually had masks available, but I walked in wearing my N95, and he thanked me and checked my temperature, so that was fine. And they had just some hand sanitizer there. They had hand sanitizer at the elevator. They had hand sanitizer at the check-in desk, and then all the seats were pretty much spread out for the waiting room. So, it seems like they're taking care of it pretty well. I didn't seem to be a very urgent feeling at the hospital, and it didn't seem to be very chaotic or anything like that. So I guess in Utah and the Salt Lake Valley, we're pretty blessed to not have too much of an outbreak yet, and it seems like our hospital workers are able to have a pretty solid control on everything.
Yeah, I know you work a little bit in the medical field, and I know Sheldon, I'm talking to you talk a little bit about what some things that you've seen there. I know we didn't touch on it too much. Was there kind of anything you wanted to add about what you're seeing specifically in the medical field?
Yeah, so I didn't really touch on it a whole lot last time, but kind of one of the biggest things to give you guys like a broad picture of kind of what the company that I work for does. We do locums work, which basically means traveling doctors. And we cover just about every specialty out there of finding doctors that are willing to travel and work in other hospitals to help patients. We've been having like weekly meetings with our CEO where he talks to us about how things are going with the company and how things are being affected. And a couple weeks ago, things were kind of gloom because, for a little perspective, we typically book right around 20, I think it was 29, between 25 to 29,000 days of doctors working in hospitals. We plan to have that many doctors, or have that many days of doctors working in hospitals that we're working with in like a week, right? We dropped from that to 2,400 in a matter of a couple weeks because of all the specialties starting to put off elective surgeries or elective procedures, or just things that weren't necessary, and putting that all to the side and canceling everything. And so, hospitals are losing copious amounts of money. I remember seeing a story about Intermountain Healthcare here in Utah, talking about furloughing employees. And I remember being kind of upset about it. I'm like, you guys make tons of money, but then, I'm still new at my job, and realizing that when you cut like a heart surgery or, big procedures like that, That's
Would a heart surgery be considered elective, or that's almost
I
like
mean, it depends. It depends on the severity of the situation, right? So, like, if the heart surgery is like really important, then yeah. But if it's somebody that they know that they could push it off, they're going to push it off, and so that's money that a hospital isn't making.
Sorry, I was like, I just wanted to get in right while you were talking about it. I was actually told directly to say that I was in more pain than I was actually in because they wouldn't see me unless my pain was over a 5.
Interesting.
who told you that?
That was actually what they told me at the doctor's office as I was scheduling my appointment.
Really?
And then as I was making my appointment actually over the phone, she said, like, how are you feeling right now? And I was like, I'm like, okay, like, I'm on my meds and, it just kind of come and goes. And she was like, well, like, are you in a little bit of discomfort right now? And then it like clicked in my head that the lady said to say that. And I was like, well, yeah, like, it's kind of a constant thing. And, I am pretty uncomfortable. And she was like, okay, yeah, let's get you in 2 days.
Yeah.
So, and other than that, it would have been a 2-week waiting period. So,
Oh, so they don't want to see anyone unless it's mandatory. And yeah, I have heard
yeah.
kind of the same thing, that some hospitals are starting to lay people off, which is just like, what? Why?
Yeah, and the reason is they're losing tons of money.
Yeah, and it kind of makes sense because they're built as such profit machines right now. They're built to extract wealth from the population, and then something comes through where it's like, oh shit, we need to ditch that model, the wealth extraction, and get back to actually just saving people's lives. And it's like, oh well, that's really not that profitable.
Yeah, so like, for example, this is April 7th. I pulled up an article that says 227 hospital furloughs, furloughing workers in response to COVID-19. I know that in some of my marketing and calling doctors and things like that, so typically for my team, for example, I'm on the OBGYN team, so we haven't seen the hit as bad as a lot of the other specialties because people are still having babies. But when I first started at the company I'm working at, we were sitting around probably 80 to 100 jobs, depending on the week, of jobs that I could call on in different states. We 2 weeks ago we dropped, 2 weeks ago we dropped to 0 jobs because hospitals weren't wanting to take traveling doctors. I was having to change my message to when I'm talking to doctors, like, hey, do you know of any facilities that are in need of help? And change my message with doctors like, hey, like, is your facility in need of help? Or if I had a job, it was like calling on doctors that are with a 100-mile radius that can drive to the facility. But most doctors that I'm talking to are like, we're strapped, we're locked down, we can't go anywhere. I've talked to doctors that are in the military that have been told by the government that they're not supposed to do anything outside of their military work. So even doctors are kind of being locked down into their facilities, not being able to work, or and if they're catching it, then other doctors are having to try and fill in for them. And the thing about locums work is that it's designed to help be able to have a doctor come in and cover when a doctor's out sick, out on vacation, or leaving the hospital, or whatever it might be. They might be seeing a larger influx of patients, and because of this whole thing, doctors are being told to stay where they're at, and at the same time, the places that they're at, or their providers are getting sick sometimes, and so then they don't have the coverage and they're getting overwhelmed. And like, that's exactly the kind of scare that started this whole quarantine, was that if our doctors start getting sick, they can't take care of us because they're going to be overloaded. You're going to have one doctor to 100 patients a day, and that's just wild. I mean, for some specialties, not like if you're an emergency room doctor, that's not in some large facilities, that's not crazy. But like, just into some perspective, like an OBGYN will typically see on the high end about 30 to 40 patients a day. let's get rid of just about every OB in a hospital because they're sick, except for if the hospital's staffed with 3 or 4 OBGYNs, they're then going to be seeing and 2 of them get sick. That doubles up the patient load for just those 2 doctors, and they're working just crazy hours to try and keep up with the patient load that they're having, right? So that's just some of the stuff I've seen on my end. It's wild, and our company has even had to try and take different measures to stop from doing layoffs and things like that. Like my CEO, he's decided to go 4 months without pay to help us be able to make it weather the storm as we talk about. Yeah.
Did you say you're still doing some work just from home now?
I'm doing my job is completely the same, and we're actually seeing an uptick in our jobs now. We've actually, I think, my team opened up 13 jobs across the nation this week in OBGYN, so that's good. We're seeing some growth there, but other specialties still aren't seeing as much of that.
Yeah, that's. I was going to say that's probably one of the first things that we'll see start to make a comeback is the elective surgeries and all the different fields that you're talking about. Just because if there is these empty rooms and empty parts of the hospital and doctors that aren't working, and we don't necessarily need them elsewhere, then it would definitely make sense to start getting back to those pretty important things. And what you were kind of describing kind of just reminded me of the supply and demand problems that we're having in the markets. I mean, you're basically describing this as if it's like a doctor market, and you're saying there's problems on the demand side, as in, they're kind of closing things down and not letting people do the surgeries, and then also the shortage of the supply side of doctors that are specifically equipped to handle the specific situation that we're handling. And so there's some doctors that aren't working and they're just not in the right places at the right times. And that kind of reminds me a lot of what we're seeing in the supply chain altogether, as in, like how they're having to pour out a bunch of milk and kill a bunch of chickens and kill a bunch of pigs is just because of the dynamics of the supply chain itself isn't built to just auto-correct any problem. It's built to work a certain way, and when something comes in and shakes that up, then it's not just a matter of reallocating those resources. It requires a totally different structure of the supply of whatever that may be, doctors or food or energy or anything.
Yeah, it's been kind of wild to watch the shift in different markets of how things have changed. I mean, I took a basic economics class in college, and when one thing that we learned about is when something shifts in the market, sometimes you'll see businesses that don't typically make or do a certain thing change what they're doing and make something else. Like I've heard of clothing companies start making masks and stop making clothing. There was even an article put out by I think it was Deseret News talking about how a company that typically makes the undergarments for members of the church, their underwear, and they're like not doing that, or like their temple clothing too, and then they're starting to make like PPE equipment.
I think the technical term is Jesus jammies.
Yes. Yeah, we'll try not to offend our religious counterparts, but yes.
Yeah, I was gonna say we may have lost a few viewers there. A few Karens were lost in the battle.
So, but yeah, it's just kind of crazy watching some of these companies make these changes in what they're doing, and the shift in the way that places are doing business and things like that. So,
I was gonna say, I know in California that even as they're like starting to try to do some sort of soft reopen, they're requiring everybody in public to wear masks now. That it's an actual requirement. Apparently that you can even get fined for.
But maybe we'll just go ahead and jump into the numbers. We seem to be having a little bit of technical issues, unfortunately. I wish we could hear CJ a little bit better, but let's go ahead and jump into the numbers. We are currently at 3.4 million cases worldwide. That's confirmed cases. I'm sure there's much more than that. And here in the U.S., we are still seeing very, very high amounts of cases. I believe the highest we've had in one day is 38 or 39,000, and we just saw 36,000 today. So, it's kind of all over the place. I've seen as low as like 18,000 in one day recently, and then yesterday we had over 20,000, and today over 36,000. And one of the kind of the main things I wanted to point out, a couple things here I wanted to point out. If we look at the United States and go state by state, we're starting to see a little bit of a decline in New York itself. Obviously, they were the hot spot. They were seeing 600 or 700 deaths per day. And now air quotes, they only had 4,300 new cases today, which is still a lot. And they only had 289 deaths today. So, but yet we are still seeing near record-breaking cases for the country. So that basically means that we are starting to see larger and larger outbreaks in all of the other states. Here in Utah, we were kind of slowing down a little bit. I was seeing maybe like 100, 120, maybe like an 80 case day, somewhere in there. And now we are back up to 150 cases per day. And I'm still hearing some things to where maybe people that are dying at home aren't being tested. So we do have a very low amount of official deaths right now, 46. But we are, there's a lot of talk of people opening. I was just talking with my wife before the show, and she was at the liquor store, and she said she saw one of the biggest lines there she's ever seen. And, everyone was wearing their party clothes and their outfits to go on a night out on the town. I know some bars are possibly talking of opening. I'm sure a lot of people are looking to meet up with their friends, in the mood that seems to be going around, at least with some people. There's a lot of people that are definitely taking this seriously. And I'm glad that, I posted a post on my personal page that was basically saying, look, I think we're going to have a big second outbreak. I didn't say we should or shouldn't be opening, but I basically said the fact that we are opening, I think we're going to see a lot of cases. And I got a good response from everyone, and I got 20 likes, which is a lot for shit that I post. So in my mind, that kind of showed that there's a good amount of people that do agree with the fact that this needs to be taken serious. But on the other hand, there's a whole big group of people that are just absolutely they don't want to be seen taking this seriously at all. That is just way too, it's, for lack of a better word, it just seems like it's uncool in their mind to even talk about the virus, to focus on the virus. They feel like they're being tricked if they take it seriously. And that's why I think we're definitely going to see I think this today pretty much marks the start of the next big outbreak that we are going to see, even though this outbreak, this first one, hasn't even slowed down or stopped at all.
Interesting. Kind of on that note, like I talked a little bit on the last episode about my trip when I flew to Vegas. I got to my flight early when I got to my gate early, I guess, when I was leaving, and I hadn't had dinner yet, and so they actually had like one restaurant in there open, and they were letting some people come in, but like in the bar area where they had stools and whatnot, they had actually unscrewed the stools in a couple spots, so like you couldn't actually sit there. Um, it was just a pole sticking out of the ground, yeah. Um, and they had like paper, on the like a piece of paper with instructions on like, this is what's going on and this is why you can't sit around. It's kind of funny that we have to keep putting those things up like people don't know, but I guess if we take them down, then people are going to start going completely back to the way that we were doing things without trying to be healthy at all. So yeah, I thought that just kind of an example of a real life example of what I've seen based off of what you were talking about, CJ.
So it sounds like rules wise, we're looking pretty good. So I guess it comes down to, first of all, who is going to follow the rules for the businesses that open. I mean, because it's going to be a case by case thing. Who's going to follow it as far as the customers and the employees? We shall see. Obviously, the state can't keep tabs on everyone, so it's going to be more of a you need to just kind of check up on yourself and make sure that every business is itself doing what they're supposed to be doing. And with how I've been talking about how the mood has kind of just been going towards somewhat of a more relaxed mood towards it. Most people feel like we're not really in a crisis so much anymore. I bet we're going to see quite a bit of just parties and underground shows and just people just getting together with their homies they haven't seen in a while. I think that's going to pick up, and people wearing masks at that, I don't see being like. What do you mean? Oh yeah, and there's probably people that have been doing that the whole time, but yeah, I think the mood is getting a little more relaxed though, so we shall see. Hopefully, we can keep somewhat of a good case count here in Utah. I really don't want to just have this to where a bunch of people in my neighborhood have it. It's been fairly relaxed so far. I do think as a nation, we are going to see a pretty strong second outbreak, but hopefully in our immediate vicinity, it remains fairly safe. But I did want to point out a couple other things I noticed while we're here and the U.S. numbers. First of all, Georgia, which I believe they were the first ones to start opening. I'm not 100% sure where they stand now, but they saw 1,200 new cases today. So still very, very prevalent there. Starting to really get a foothold in Massachusetts, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Florida, Texas. All those places are getting over 1,000 cases per day. And then if you scroll down to the bottom here, there's a couple more categories here that aren't states. One of them is called Veteran Affairs. I'm not 100% sure what that is, but they have 9,000 cases total, 404 of which they saw today, and 500 deaths. So that's a good. I'm assuming that has something to do with the elderly, and so they've seen a really high death rate in that so far. 500 out of 9,000. That would be 5%. No, but a little over 5%. No, 500 total. Yeah, so a little over 5% death rate in that specific category. And then they also have a U.S. military category, which that's kind of interesting. Although am highly suspect of whether this would be accurate or not, because obviously every military of every country wants to present themselves as not having any weaknesses or anything. So, but they do say they have 7,000 reported cases, which is quite a bit. And if that's an under exaggeration, then who knows how bad it could be in the military. Also, they have
Well, that could be like with the like the military bases. Like my dad actually works on Hill Air Force Base, and he's talked about hearing about some cases happening up there. None that are in the specific building that he works in, but yeah, that I would assume that that's actually fairly accurate for the military bases. And 7,000 across the number of military bases is across the U.S. Like a military base is like a city in and of itself, just about. Just the I've been on Hill Air Force Base a couple times with my dad and other individuals that I know that are military and can get on, and they have stores, they have a theater, they have a bowling alley, they have that kind of stuff. Um, and parks and things, but they've been doing a lot of things to. I bet you that anyone living on base is locked down probably quite a bit more than out here in the civilian space, but yeah, on base is there's definitely, people traveling, moving army around, or any kind of military personnel that's coming in contact with anything, or that could even encompass military personnel and bases that are, worldwide, I would think too.
Yeah, I did too. And I think in that same article, I heard that there's kind of been some concealing of the whole cases in general. I don't know. Something I briefly saw, just something to consider. All the militaries may or may not be trying to, keep that under wraps a little bit. But there's also another category here, federal prisons, and there's 2,000 in that. I'm glad they broke this all up. And then a category beneath that is the Navajo Nation, which is something me and CJ actually talked about a little bit, about how maybe this could affect different local, different tribes across the whole world that are kind of isolated from the rest of the population. Would they totally get a pass on this and not get infected at all? Or if it did get in there, would it be much more difficult for them?
Yeah, I know. It's just one of those things that, especially with those, remote people that are like, in the Amazon, and like we talked about those, the people that live off the coast of India that have zero contact with the outside world. Like, if this thing starts hitting those places and they're not reaching out to us, like, they could entirely disappear. I mean, essentially that's like what we're leaning towards, and it's getting real scary in the sense that we keep talking about reopening and trying to reopen stuff when, like we had the second highest number of cases that we've had in the United States today. And like, that's not something to take lightly. And then we're just going to continue to figure out ways to, make it to where people can congregate. And these cases are going to just keep going up from there. And I totally agree with you in that second wave. It's just it's gonna take more of a hold than it has this first wave, and we probably will see more remote people and a lot more cases in places like Africa and places that we haven't seen a lot of cases, or I guess heard of a lot of cases that are there.
Yeah, I know in Brazil, we've been seeing quite a bit of cases there. I believe they're up to about 80,000. 1 second, let me pull this up really quick. Brazil, 92,000. And that's kind of something that's just been recently shooting up. They had 500 deaths just today out of the 6,400 they have. So, yeah, and who knows how well all of these places are really keeping track of their numbers. But yeah, that's the second wave, I think, is going to be something that's going to be a really big thing as this comes through. And, I'm hearing some pretty interesting things about the origin of this virus or possible origins of it. And I'm hearing a lot of bad things about Dr. Fauci. I know the media has kind of painted this picture of it's like Trump versus Fauci. Trump's the one who wants to open the economy, and Fauci's the one who thinks that it needs to be taken seriously and the health risks are really high. But Fauci has connections with that lab in Wuhan where it has a very high chance that it could have come from. And from what I just barely heard from Dr. Martinson's podcast today, they're putting out all this information that there's no possible way it could have been created from humans. Their equations would have never come up with it in a million years from random equations trying to figure it out. But Dr. Martinson brought up an interesting point that if somebody was purposely trying to find or trying to basically combine different DNA strands of different viruses, you wouldn't need such a random process of figuring this out. There's a much more logical route that you could go if you were trying to experiment on viruses in general. And I don't know if there's any proof so far that they created this virus for the purpose of releasing it into the population, although I could definitely see that being a possibility. But for sure, Dr. Fauci was somehow involved through the money with financing this lab in Wuhan to specifically create or study that it's a little vague on coronaviruses specifically. And then this comes out all of a sudden, and what where my mind goes is with how things have been in the global markets and just how much debt there is and just how bad things have been looking for the US and the globe. Maybe they would release something like this, make something like this, and then release it because it's not going to kill everybody, but it is going to just shake up everything and be the perfect scapegoat to basically blame this huge financial crash that we were heading into. It may have been a few years off, maybe even 10 years off, but that we've definitely been under a lot of financial stress and instability throughout the world. And there's a lot of things that we don't even know that's been going on, things that has been going off the Fed's balance sheet. The Fed's balance sheet has been shooting up like crazy. I actually have that right here. We can kind of segue into this and get into some more of the financial news here. So the Fed's balance sheet is basically a good measure of how much money printing we've had to do. And this is just kind of one window to look through. There's so many different ways they have to put money into different parts of the market. But basically this chart I'm looking at here goes all the way back to 2003. And, that was before the 2008 financial crisis. And it was just going at a real steady pace, slowly working its way up to 1 trillion. So, back into the 90s and 80s, we were just kind of following this straight path, this really gradual path up to 1 trillion, which is basically the Fed's created $1 trillion to buy back assets that nobody else wanted. And because nobody wanted them, the price would have crashed. So the Fed steps in and buys them to create stability in the market. And then the crash comes along in 2008, and we jump from 1 trillion up to 2 trillion in a matter of a month or 6 months or so. And then things really start to get rocky from there. They kind of start to go up and down because when they started buying all these, they basically promised everyone that they were going to get rid of them and kind of re-normalize the balance sheet so that way the market's not so manipulated. And then over from 2008 all the way up to 2012, we rise up to 3 trillion. So that's, a good 4 years of time. We go from 2 trillion to 3 trillion. So, really bad at the time. People at the time would have been just freaking out from this, saying, this is going to cause hyperinflation. It's going to weaken the dollar. This is when gold had its famous rally up to 1900, which is its all-time highs. And then, from 2012, we kind of chill for a little bit till 2013, and then some shit starts going wrong again, and they start ramping up. And I believe this was QE3. So there's been QE1, the initial bond buying purchases, and then QE2, and then QE3 happened. It looks like around 2013, and then that ramped up to 2014 all the way up to 4.5 trillion. And this is the number we've been kind of chilling at for a while. We've been trying to normalize interest rates and kind of get rid of this. And from about 2014 to the late 2018, we sat at 4.5 trillion on this balance sheet. So that kind of shows there was, at least some. It looked like things were kind of stabilizing there. And then Powell started coming out and saying we're going to try and reduce the balance sheet, which is what everyone really wants to happen. But yet they tried to do that for, it looks like about 6 months. We went from 4.5 trillion to 3.7 trillion. And then the infamous Powell Pivot, which is where everything changed. This was September of 2019, which if you ask some financial experts, they will say that's when this crisis officially started, was in September of 2019 when the repo markets broke, which I know a good amount of people heard about that, but it's one of those things that not a lot of people know what the repo markets are. So, it broke, and then they started buying up a bunch more treasuries. They started putting a bunch of money into the repo market to fix the problem. And that brought it back up to 4.5 trillion. So he basically just undid everything. And then starting on February of 2020, which is when the coronavirus news really made it into the markets, we went from 4.1 trillion to 6.6 trillion where we are now. So we added 2 trillion in 2 months. So keep in mind that 2 trillion, it took us from from 2003 to 2013 to add 2 trillion to this balance sheet the first time. And then we just barely added another 2 trillion in 2 months. So that really shows how unstable things have been lately. And all right, well, I will just go ahead and move on to this next thing that I want to talk about, and we'll just chop this up. Hopefully, it's recording my voice pretty good. But going along with what I was saying about the Fed's balance sheet, how that's been it's what people call a hockey stick graph, where it's just kind of going along and then boom, it just shoots straight up. There's a lot of different hockey stick graphs we've seen, and the Fed's balance sheet is one of them, and also the M2 money supply, which both of these graphs are from the Fed website, and the M2 money supply basically measures how much total dollars there is in the system, and it's also including things like treasuries and very liquid assets, which is you could almost see them as dollars. This has been going up at a very, very steady rate. This chart goes back to 2015, at least the way I have it set now. And it's just a really slow, gradual line all the way up from 12 trillion to 15.5 trillion, which has taken us about 5 years to go up that 3 trillion. And then when this crisis started in February, we're at 15.5 trillion M2 money supply. And then that jumped all the way up to 17.2 trillion. So basically in real money out there in the system, there's been an added 2 trillion recently. So yeah, who knows what this is really going to do. Getting back to what I was saying about the origin of the virus, there seems to be a lot of sketchy things about Fauci, and maybe this was kind of released to some sort of like you were saying on the last show, some sort of equalizer. Have you guys thought about that possibility?
Oh yeah, definitely. I don't know. I don't know what reasoning I have behind to 100% believe that, other than the fact that I do believe in some conspiracy theories. Yeah, it's definitely a possibility.
I don't know. It's just like we know where it originated from. I mean, at least country-wise, and if anything, I feel like at the end of all this, if not now, we're gonna definitely see a case involving China being put on the stand.
Yeah, I think the interesting to think about too is that what if it was some other organization, government, whatever, that is just trying to pin it on China, and it wasn't actually China. I've kind of thought about that too. I mean, that's getting into more conspiracy theories and kind of getting away from things, but just kind of something to think about. That I try and look at all avenues of options and not try and kind of leave the innocent till proven guilty. But I mean, everything points to China. But what if? What if?
I'm gonna blame Madagascar. They seem the most innocent.
The penguins from Madagascar.
No, if I had to point it on anybody, I guess that would be like Russia, just planting it in China and then making it to where the U.S. is at face with China, and then causing the issues in a global.
That would be interesting because Russia and China actually have a fairly good relationship, from what I know.
Yeah.
So we hear.
How's our relationship with Russia?
Everything's up. I feel everything is just up in the air, just completely unknown. It's so, like you're saying, all signs point to China for sure, and we can say for sure that the CCP messed up in covering this up. But so if there's just one extra piece of data that's like, oh yeah, somebody sent it over to them, then that puts everything into question. And we're going to see lawsuits. There's already starting lawsuits to sue China. And man, I just don't know where to plant my feet on this, because all signs point to blaming China, and I really almost kind of want to jump on that boat, because at least it would be an answer. But then it's like, oh shit, well, what if I'm being tricked into thinking that that's the real thing? And kind of another point I wanted to add with, and this is, just getting into some of the more dark, mysterious what ifs, with how we are opening the economy here in the U.S. It's like, do they really think that's going to work? Do they really think that this is not going to lead to a huge second outbreak, or do they want a big outbreak to happen? It almost seems like there's almost some intention behind it, because I can obviously tell that it's going to lead to a second outbreak. Government officials have way more information than I do. Really raises some questions in my mind of what is their motive behind this, or maybe the
It's like
system.
I was gonna say, it's like you're out in the middle of in the army and something, and you're in the middle of a war. You're getting shot at. You get shot, and somebody throws a Band-Aid over that gunshot wound, and they're like, "Okay, you're good to go. Keep fighting." Like, it's not going to be successful. I don't understand where these officials are getting their ideas. Like, okay, cool, we could reopen the economy and everything's going to be fine. This is just going to result in a much bigger outbreak and a much stricter lockdown.
Something that just crossed my mind. Maybe they kind of know that this isn't the best idea, but just with the state of the economy, all the numbers I was just going over, all the money printing we've had to do, I calculated they're paying out over $30 billion a week in unemployment. They don't just have that money laying around. Maybe they just kind of want to tell everyone they think it's going to be fine, just because that's what people need to hear, not to freak out. But really, we just have to open up because of the dire situation in the economy.
Yeah, there was something interesting that I saw. I follow like a conspiracy theory page. It's kind of just for fun, but somebody posted something about the unemployment, and I going back to that podcast I mentioned last time with TED Talk, and the guy talking about things that he thought would happen in the future. And he talked about something called UBI. I don't know if any of you guys have ever heard of that or know what it means.
Yeah, what that Asian guy running for shit, I can't remember his name, but he wanted
Andrew
to bring
Yang.
universal basic income to
Andrew
Yang.
Universal basic income, that's right. And in a way, what if this is a way to kind of force people into that, and make people dependent on their government for support, and control and stuff like that. I don't know. Kind of an interesting thought, but yeah.
My thing too is like, okay, if they come down to it and they're like, okay, this thing came from a bat, like bats migrate, like things migrate, things like a bat could fly. We have no idea where this bat came from. China gets stuff like sent to them all the time. I mean, I guarantee they have pig's feet from Brazil and bats from the Philippines, and it's just, there's really no, when it comes down to it, and if it was what they're saying, like, oh, this guy got a bat and it was infected and that's what got him infected, then it's going to come down to like, okay, where the hell did this bat come from? And like you were saying, like, did somebody plant it? Like, was one country trying to get some sort of reaction out of this? And I mean,
I think honestly the bat theory is looking pretty slim right now. I know that's kind of what they're trying to say, but I mean, I heard that the wet market that they blamed that on, they didn't even sell bats there. It was just kind of something that China just started saying at first to take the heat off of them, and then now, I'm pretty sure they like destroyed that whole market, and they've done a lot of things to hide people looking into the lab. But yeah, I personally don't think that it came. I think the chances of it, first of all, jumping from bat to human is very, very slim. So it seems very, very likely that this is a virus that has been modified by people.
Well, and that's one thing too. That I mean, okay, yeah, it's possibly been modified by the human race, but there's certain things that like you have to take into account when it comes down to viruses, especially ones like COVID. Like it was a mutation, from the original or from a coronavirus, and therefore the most likely thing to say would be that something did have it, whether it be a bat or whatever, and had bit another animal, whether it be pork, poultry, beef, whatever, and that had mutated it, and a human being ate that, and instead of it being super crazy outbreaks between like that the meat market or whatever, just because that one animal was the one that got bitten, and it wasn't super contagious, maybe like maybe it was pigs and they just weren't super contagious, but since they got bit by this bat, the virus did a mutation, and whether somebody went out and cut up this hog and ate it, or if what if some they got bit by it. There's so much science that goes into it, especially when it comes down to things like viruses. Like mutations happen all the time, and that's why we continuously look for the next flu virus, the next the next opening, so that way we can continuously investigate it. And I mean, I guess that's where it comes down to when the idea of it being man-made or being made in a lab or being manipulated in a lab. I mean, it's definitely possible, but I feel like a natural mutation is almost a more likely source of the outbreak.
It just seems the evidence for the that it actually came from a bat. It just doesn't really seem to be anything at all actually supporting that. But definitely possible. There's a lot of different things that could be possible from this. If I had to guess, it was probably it accidentally snuck out of a lab, because I know they are doing all sorts of these different tests with coronaviruses. They're testing mutations. I'm not exactly sure why they're attempting to figure out how dangerous of a virus they could make. But we're talking labs in China. China's not known for being perfectionists. They're kind of more known for saving money and doing things quick ways. And who knows? It's something like a virus so extremely contagious, and this one can survive on surfaces for days, and one little mistake could have just caused this to get out. And if that is the case, then wow, we really need to think of what we're doing in these labs, because I don't see too much potential upside for experimenting with extremely dangerous viruses, but there's a lot of potential downside.
Yeah, and I mean that it's very true, and it's something that I mean we definitely need to look into, especially with the way that these viruses do get manipulated in labs. And I mean that it's a total possibility that they added one right thing to that petri dish that had SARS corona or whatever, and that mutated into this current COVID-19 that we have.
An interesting kind of to put in another plug for another podcast that I've listened to, but I recommend listening to the whole series. But The End of the World by Josh Clark, and it's episode 6, and he talks about biotechnology. Natural viruses and bacteria can be deadly enough, but he talks about how the government. Like the synopsis on that episode basically says natural viruses and bacteria can be deadly enough. The 1918 Spanish flu killed 50 million people in 4 months, but risky new research carried out in an unknown number of labs around the world are creating even more dangerous handmade pathogens. So, I mean, it's something that is definitely happening, and it even says here, unknown number of labs around the world.
Yeah, I mean, it makes perfect sense. It's like I can almost think of a really good analogy. I mean, there's just so many people world and that we're so connected that something like a virus could just come through and just devastate things. It's just this I think it made the dry tinder analogy where it's just like, as a society, we're basically like this forest with all this tinder built up just waiting, and we're all vaccinated and we all have immune systems that aren't used to having all these new threats come in. So something comes in like this coronavirus and it just infects everybody and can just do unprecedented amounts of damage. And there's a lot of things in our society that could just one little tweak could end up changing a lot of things. And I think these viruses, like you're talking about, is one more thing that we need to keep our attention focused on. And you know what, hopefully this at least will kind of make us think about our mortality as a globe and our fragility.
Yeah, one thing I've always kind of hoped, like in positivity that comes out of this, is that hopefully people can at some point look at the globe and the human race and like humans in general and just be like, this is something so small that could take out everything that we have created, art, you know, history, like everything that's ever been created by man could be wiped out in an instant. And it could happen, maybe not in an instant with this virus, but it could happen quickly. And if we keep fighting each other and we keep bickering and keep playing this name game instead of trying to work together to solve this in the best way possible that's going to keep the human race alive, or just realize that we are so small and insignificant floating around on a rock in the middle of this big black, ethos, that maybe we can stop taking for granted the human experience and start like really respecting each other as humans, regardless of the color of your skin or your religion or whatever it is. Because for me, in the end, we all bleed red, and I think it's important, and hopefully people can gain some insight to that from all this.
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing that I really do hope, and I mean, I've seen a lot of it too in countries like Italy and countries like Spain, and I mean, I actually even seen a little parade today out here in Holiday that they had the fire trucks and the police officers and everything with all their sirens on, and people were coming out and clapping. And I mean, it's kind of like this one of the bright side of things is that it really is bringing a lot of people together, and it's making a lot of people realize that if you have more, it's totally acceptable to share what you can and help everybody get by. And I mean, we're all just trying to make it to the end of this thing.
We are seeing some good things out of humanity that I think are really great. Yeah, I've definitely seen a lot of posts of people sharing, like a copied post of people being like, "Hey, if you don't have enough food, let me know. You shouldn't go hungry. I will cook you a meal because I know that I have food." And you have all these doomsday people and see these things on TV about people prepping and getting guns and having to protect your own, and which I understand that, but at the same time, like, why not try and open up and share the wealth that we all so abundantly have, because we survive together, not alone.
Yeah, what you guys are saying just really triggering a lot of things that I've been reading from the Fourth Turning book. I'm not sure if you've heard me talk on that at all, Sheldon. It's basically a book that describes history through 90-year cycles, and specifically 90 years because that's how long basically a long human life is. So, and it says that basically every 90 years we kind of go through a new crisis, and that's because as we exit a crisis, there's a lot of lessons we learn from that crisis, specifically lessons about resiliency and about not necessarily trying to take advantage of everyone and get as much profit, but rather we're kind of all in this together, and we need to have a good, wholesome society. And why do we think that? It's because we just went through a crazy crisis, and we see what happens when we don't respect each other, and we let things get out of hand. And basically, we are at every 90 years, and this is a cycle that goes back for a very long time. We've had 6 cycles in the US so far. The last 3 were the Revolutionary War in 1750, I believe, and then the Civil War in 1860, and then the Great Depression and World War II, which happened 1930 to 1950. So that last major crisis was about 90 years ago. So according to Neil Howe, we are in a 4th turning society because there's 4 turnings that happen after each crisis. So we are in that society that is prepped and ready for another massive crisis to come through. And, that it makes a lot of sense with the things you're saying. We don't really see our sameness. We're kind of become a society that's focused all on differences and the gain for the self rather than gain for the community. And I wrote a little, I know you said you may need to go at some point, Sheldon, so if you do need to, feel free at any point. But
okay.
But I did write a little bit of something here about the 4th turning. So I say we've been going for a little while now. We were going to touch a lot on China today, but I guess we'll go ahead and
we'll touch on that next time.
We also couldn't find very much information on China.
That's true about the second outbreak. By the way, just so everyone knows, we get this in at least, there is organ harvesting in China, and they do have concentration camps where they're keeping Muslims. So just want to get that out so everyone knows the crazy shit that's going on over there.
Not the Chinese people. China, then all you gotta do is go to the right market, give the guy $30,000, and you can get an 18-year-old white boy's liver.
Exactly, dude. Choose whatever one you want, have it in 2 weeks. And keep in mind, I know we do say a lot about things about China. I fully respect, and I could say I even love the Chinese people. I feel a lot of empathy towards the Chinese people because they're the ones that are most closely affected by the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party is definitely evil force in the world today. So, and like I said, there's a lot of misinformation, and who knows, maybe they see us the same way or something. But let me go ahead and get into this thing I wrote about the 4th turning. It's about efficiency versus resiliency. And it's been kind of my observation as I've been reading about the 4 turnings, how it goes from one end of the scale to the other end. And there's a lot of different things that he describes in the book. Like, for instance, one of the things is you go from overprotecting your children to underprotecting your children as you go through these 4 cycles. And something I noticed that he didn't write about is we go from a resilient society and we slowly work our way to a more efficient society as we get further and further away from the crisis because we no longer believe that resiliency is that big of a deal. So it's my observation that the turnings or cycles can be measured in times of resilience versus times of efficiency. Society swings back and forth on this pendulum as it goes from crisis to crisis. During and immediately following a crisis, society believes the value of it values resilience over efficiency and profitability. That happens right after the crisis because you still feel the pain. Like imagine the people that went through the Great Depression that were actually worried about the food that they were going to get, or they're worried about their sons and daughters being sent to fight in wars. That pain was really there. And when humans learn, we mostly learn from pain. So if we're experiencing a lot of pain, then we're gonna change our mindset and be like, oh shit, all these things I wasn't paying attention to, I need to now pay attention to. Populations and businesses shift to a more self-sustained mindset, and people grow their own food. They start their own businesses. Businesses simplify their supply chain and trim the fat on their expenses so they can become more resilient. Some businesses relying on complex supply chains may shut down altogether if they can't adapt to this new world that they're in post-crisis. The vivid pain felt from the current or recent crisis makes people evaluate what is really important to them. As the years go by, businesses keep their guard up, but yet eventually start to focus more and more on the profits. So they start taking more risks and kind of start slowly working their way to efficiency as the crisis becomes something in the rearview mirror. As generations age and die, the lessons learned from the last crisis fade as profits and risk become ever more important. This transition is justified because everything has remained relatively stable for the past 50 years. The recency bias convinces everyone to create more and more aggressive practices, more complex and immediate supply chains, larger leveraged bets with their debt in the equity markets. In fact, the environment becomes such that resilience becomes a burden. It becomes a disadvantage to any company that can't keep up with the high risk environment. So the people that have kind of shifted towards resiliency, they now find themselves behind everybody. That's simplifying their supply chain and changing their business model to be more risk. This creates a slow shift of all companies to even more and more fragile business models in the name of profits. Once this has gone on for several more decades past the crisis, the society becomes ripe for another crisis. Turn the page here. Anything can provide this slight nudge toward instability. Any minor inconvenience can be the straw that breaks the camel's back. Because, like I said last show, everyone goes all in. So they price the market to perfection, and they think resiliency is a joke at that point, and that they just need to take the most amount of risk to make the most amount of profits, and they have to do that just to stay relevant. So it's kind of everyone kind of forces each other to be more and more competitive, because if you're not, then you get left behind. Many potential crises arise in a society that's maturing and moving closer and closer to fragility. But a society that remembers a recent crisis has a much more effective approach to any problem that shows up. So, for instance, what I'm calling a crisis now, this virus, if it would have came through in a more resilient society, and one key feature that marks resiliency is leadership and media that you can trust. That's a very defining aspect of resiliency, because if everybody can trust a leader and trust the media and trust the government, then this whole process could be much, much smoother. We could get masks on everyone. We could stop with all the dishonesty, but yet we are in this fourth turning society, which does not have that type of good leadership, which could make this not that big a deal. If we had good leadership, this may not even have left China. It may not even turn into a crisis, period. But since we're in a fragile fourth turning society, now it's grown into something that has the potential of becoming the next Great Depression. I believe the coronavirus is the black swan event that will cause us to make the shift back towards resiliency. So I think this is the line that we're crossing, where all of a sudden efficiency becomes less important, and we start making the move back towards resiliency, back towards community and simplicity over efficiency and profit. These wheels have already been set in motion, actually. Weakness in the U.S. supply chain, with what we've been hearing with the PPE and the pharmaceuticals, which we've had such a hard time getting from places like China and India, that's sparked a new desire to bring manufacturing back into the U.S. This is going to be a very key thing that we start to see coming up in the media and just talked about in a lot of places, is really getting manufacturing back into the U.S. Trump's been talking about it a lot. We've made some moves, but I think this is going to be a very big thing in the near future. This is great long term, make no mistake, but it will not be an easy process, period. This is a very huge thing we're talking about here. The U.S. economy is a consumption-based economy, and we create a symbiosis with China, the manufacturing economy. Both countries have built their economy around this symbiosis. The debt is actually structured in such a way that it requires a constant flow of dollars out of the U.S. towards China. So basically, what's the most important thing you think of before you take on a lot of debt? Well, how much money are you bringing in? And basically, the more money you're bringing in, the more debt that you can go into. So since we're sending so much money to China and to other countries, they have in return taken out huge amounts of debt to support the manufacturing and such. And so that, if the income gets shaken up at all, then that debt no longer becomes viable. And so that debt is going to come into question as we start moving things out of China and other countries. This demand for dollars outside of the U.S. has kept inflation at bay because we've printed as much money as we want here to basically create stimulus and just basically do whatever the fuck we want as the U.S. Because of this artificial demand for dollars outside of the country because of the way that they've structured the debt. This transition towards bringing manufacturing back to the U.S. will be enough by itself to create massive financial problems in both countries, maybe even possibly a full debt restructuring, like how I talked about in the last show. The coronavirus has revealed the debt crisis, which we were already in the midst of. So most people wouldn't say we were in a crisis before this, but we were in a debt crisis. It just wasn't so
The debt
obvious.
crisis has been growing for probably the last 20 years, and it's one president blaming the next.
Exactly. And then once the president gets in there, most presidents run on the idea that they're going to be the one to fix the deficit. Trump said if he had 2 terms in office, he would take the deficit back down to 0. And what do you know? It's increased the whole time. Obviously, no one can blame him too much for the increase now because it is a crisis. But that happens in every presidency. They say they're going to start decreasing it. Something comes up and they start increasing it. And let's be honest, he's had made no attempt whatsoever to decrease the debt or deficit or raise interest rates, which would be a very healthy
thing. Oh, no,
thing.
come on. He was going to make Mexico build the wall.
Oh, yeah. that would have I might have gained a little respect for him if he actually did that. But yeah, I mean, he's said so many things that he just has no intention of doing. And like every president, the people who love him overlook the things that he said that he's not doing, and the people that hate him pay a lot of attention to the things that he's not doing. But every president doesn't do what they say they're going to do. Their followers just decide to overlook that. But let me go ahead and end this. The debt crisis is likely to lead to currency problems in all corners of the world. I'm talking mostly about United States and China with this issue, but there's so many countries out there with dollar-denominated debt, and if the supply chain doesn't stay perfectly intact the way it is, then that debt is going to become a huge problem for a lot of different countries.
Well, yeah, I mean, like China and the U.S. were probably the largest economic powerhouses in the entire world, and if one of us fails, I mean, it all kind of goes down. Just like if the European Union was to fail altogether, like that would hurt the global economy. It's we're all, like you've kind of talked about, so intertwined in so many different ways that one of us fails, we're all going to kind of go down, and that's what we're seeing right now.
Yeah, that's definitely 100% true, and that's why we've opened up all these currency swaps with other countries where we're basically bailing out a bunch of different countries and banks like Deutsche Bank outside in Germany. And yeah, it's a whole web of connected bullshit, and it's all through debt, and it's all expecting things to go perfectly. So I think that this system that's designed for protection or perfection is going to be shaken up entirely. I think we're going to see some really big changes in the way that we continue our debt, and this may be a decade-long process of us printing more money and getting more weight on, because every dollar we print comes down to debt that needs to be paid back basically, and the more debt you have, that just takes away from your country's efficiency. And this is happening to many big countries across the world. Japan has gone through, if we want to look at where our economy is heading, you take a look at Japan, because they have done the most money printing. They've actually bought back stocks just to keep it from crashing. They'll print money to buy back stocks, and they've had a stagnant economy for, I believe, a decade or so. But luckily, the whole world hasn't been crashing, so they've kind of stayed afloat on the fact that the rest of the world's doing all right. But if the whole world is kind of in that money printing situation, who knows where it's going to lead? I think it's going to take a lot, 5-10 years, but I don't think we can keep going the way that we're going. I think we're starting to reach some limits of the debt.
Absolutely. There's always a ceiling.
Yeah.
And what goes up must come down. Gravity works in a lot of different ways.
I mean, we're not going to see anything good come out of this other than, maybe get a good idea on how the general public and even each country, can react and handle this situation together responsibly, rather than, kind of it be an every man for themselves type scenario.
Yeah, and hopefully we don't see the government trying to step in and take too much control. That is definitely the third part of this crisis. The first part is the coronavirus, the second part is the economy, and the third part is the government. And, as the worse things get, the more they are going to try and take control. And this actually represents a huge problem for the people in control. If we start having currency issues and people defaulting on their debt and jobs missing, the rich were the ones at the top of this, and they rely on all of us to stay up there. So this could potentially threaten them a lot. So we may see all sorts of crazy things from the government. I don't see them trying to keep us in our house unnecessarily. Like, they don't want us in our house. The government gains nothing from keeping us in our house, even though that's what I'm seeing all over Facebook is like, oh, the government's trying to take away your freedoms and keep you in your house. And no, if they're going to do anything, they're going to come out with like a new type of currency, like a digital currency was what I'm hearing, which would give them a lot of tracking and a lot more control. It's a very complex topic, but if you ever see a digital currency introduced from the government, be very wary, or just other type of surveillance programs. And honestly, this is what I would guess is we're going to see the government try to exert a lot of control, and then we're going to see a breaking point, which, the fourth turning idea makes me believe in that. And then we're going to see some type of real crisis from this, whether that be a war, food issues, poverty, and then we're probably going to be in that crisis for a few years of where shit is just very difficult for the world. And then we're going to start rebuilding an actual better society from that.
I want to put another plug in for another podcast. I'm sorry, but I listen to a lot of different podcasts that have some really interesting ideas. And it's called It Could Happen Here. And it's basically just talking about everything that could really lead up to, and everything that has been leading up to, the possibility of a civil war here in the U.S. It's kind of interesting that it's possible that something like this, or any more government exertion of power, could start something like that. So I encourage listeners to listen to some of those podcasts, Into the World by Josh Clark, and It Could Happen Here. So, yeah, very interesting stuff.
Is that referring to like a Democrat versus Republican civil war?
Yes and no. It definitely has like the right and left wing kind of stuff, but it goes through a couple different scenarios. I can't remember all of them, but it was a really good podcast.
No, I really hope we don't see that type of division. I hope if real crisis strikes, it brings us together. But to be brought together, you still need some kind of enemy. So I'm hoping that.
Hopefully, we can let the virus be the enemy, right?
And we all fight with masks, and even though that's probably not the fight that people are looking for, I'm really hoping that China and U.S. don't initiate some sort of conflict, because they're blasting propaganda over there about how the U.S. military brought it over there, and we're talking the story that it happened there, and a lot of countries are going to be questioning their relationship with China, and the CCP does not like being put on blast so much, and now the CCP could potentially crumble and fall from this. That may be one of the first things that we really see. And, hopefully they're not like a wolf backed into a corner and they start lashing out, and they have this whole propaganda machine. They could do all sorts of ways of lashing out, of, tricking people, making them think that the real narrative is this way, and starting conflicts in all sorts of different ways. And yeah, if we could get through this whole thing without a war, it may sound really paranoid to some people, but there's a lot of political tension out there. If we could get through this with just like an economic crash, because a war nowadays is, who knows what the fuck that would mean, with the weapons out there and the technology.
It means Fallout. It means we get to finally play Fallout in real life.
Yeah, I love that game.
And Mad Max. Max, yeah.
Yeah, we've just been playing the extended version of Plague Inc. right now with the COVID sector, but I think we're not too far away from playing
we're
Fallout.
just moving from one game to the next. Luckily, I got a lot of gaming experience, so I should end off pretty well in this world to come.
I've been playing a lot of Warzone, so I'm gonna be. I think it'll be okay. A lot of battle Warzone solos. I can handle it on my own. I'll make it to at least 5th place.
Well, I know we got a lot of millennials playing Fortnite, so hopefully it resembles Fortnite a little bit, and then they'll be good to go. Oh man, yeah. Okay. Well, we had a great chat. We had a little bit of technical difficulties in there, but I think I'll be able to edit this into pretty quality podcast. So I want to thank all of our listeners for checking out. If you got the endurance to listen to us till the very end, I thank you especially. And great talking with you, CJ and Sheldon. I hope to talk to both of you
again. Yeah, great talking with you guys.
Oh yeah, man. Always good to get a show out, and regardless of the difficulties we may have, you're pretty good at editing. You've made my music sound good, so.
Yeah, and just remind all of our listeners to go ahead and check us out on Facebook, COVID Commentary SLC. We'll see you guys next week.
Take it easy.